So we've got a few slides coming up, and we've put them in here because they're a useful resource. We've said a form, but actually some of this content you can just copy and paste into your letter if you're requesting a statutory assessment. And it goes back to those bits that I spoke about right at the beginning about the Children and Families Act 2014 and that criteria, and about where the law stands. And we actually always, when we're requesting at the charity I work for, if we're supporting a family to put in a letter for a statutory assessment, this is some of the text we always use, which is actually citing what the legal test is that the local authority must apply, which is in two parts. And that's what the slides I've talked about earlier. So the LA must, and that is a must, assess where the child or young person has or may have special educational needs, and it may be necessary for special educational provision to be made for the child or young person in accordance with the plan, an EHC plan. And that assumes there's a possibility, not a probability, of special educational needs. So we always use that text, and then we go on to having close supporting documentation. So we always do. This is our intro. And then if we go on to the next slide, Laura, please. Thank you. It's then about looking at that evidence and how you set that out. So when you're describing your child, the evidence of SEN, I mean, obviously you want to send in any documentation like their certificate of vision impairment, medical reports, hospital reports, etc. Any reports that the sensory needs service might have done for your child at school. But describe it as we've talked about in some of those videos. So made up a name here. Freddie meets the threshold for part 1 of the test. He has special educational needs, and then list it. And you'll be able to download some real examples we've done in the past from midweek onwards. So explain, he's registered as sight impaired, he's got a diagnosis, and his vision impacts on his learning in the following ways. And then list those examples that some of which we've talked about on the videos, about the challenges, about whether they need assistive technology, whether he can see the whiteboard, whether he or she can work independently, and also about the support that school have been putting in place. So he or she might have been identified as requiring support by school. Explain the interventions that have been put in place, whether he or she's been given a laptop, whether they're getting extra lessons on literacy, numeracy, and where they are, falling in working along at a par with their peers. Are they performing below their potential? I mean, that's another one of those myths that children have to be at least 2 years behind their peers. That's actually not. That is not a legal requirement to go forward with a statutory assessment. It's another of those myths. But so they might be a year behind, that they're not performing. If they're more than 2 years behind, the local authority like to apply that criteria, but it's not required by law. But if you're meeting that 2-year criteria that local authorities like to apply, then you've again got additional evidence. Laura, can you go to the next slide for me, please? So these are, again, I'll give you a couple of examples because we're running out of time, but these are examples of how you might be describing what the impact of their child's vision impairment. Do they need information broken down? Are they remembering learning? Do they need lots of prompts? Are they requiring adaptations? Can they work independently? Are they socially isolated? Again, social emotional, we said, is very important. They might be managing in the class, but have they got friendships? Are they isolated? Is that impacting on their self-esteem? All these sorts of things. And again, you'd attach any additional evidence, such as if the school has done a psych report, pop that on. Laura, next slide, please. So part 2, we had part 1, demonstrating that they've got special educational needs. Part 2 is it may be necessary for special educational provision to be made through the issuing of a plan. And then you would give your examples of why you think they need the plan. So if you've got evidence from a report that said your son or daughter needs X, Y, Z, you want to list that. But talk about, how it's impacting on their self-esteem, their confidence, what they are getting or might not be getting that you think they need to be having, like resources prepared in advance of the lesson. Especially at secondary school, that all takes a lot of extra time. So you really want to list anything that you've come across in a report or a teacher's report, or concerns, or whether you've commissioned an independent report yourself. Can you go to the next, and we'll give you examples of things you might be putting in that's very relatable to your vision impairment. We always say in the letter, this is quite a good, if it's relevant to your child, but it's quite a good statement to end on as well. So in our opinion, that because of your child's significant difficulties, without effective intervention and support, this is typically going to be the things that are going to impact upon your child: achieving their educational potential, whether they can access the curriculum on the same level as their peers. Do they take part in everything in the curriculum that everybody else is doing? Are they being excluded from areas like music or PE or things? Achieving and maintaining an appropriate self-esteem. That's a really big one, because if a child is not doing well and they start to think, well, I'm not very good at this, it's going to have a massive impact on their emotional, social, emotional, mental health and their self-esteem. And this one, achieving age-appropriate autonomy, which we described as intellectual, physical, social. So, you want your child, to the best of their abilities, to be able to achieve and do all of those things that a child without a disability is able to achieve. So whether that's physically or socially or intellectually, go on and do whatever they want to do in the world, basically. And then achieving genuine integration with your peer group. We all want our children to have friends, and have self-value and self-worth. So that's part 2 of the test. You're demonstrating why you feel that they need it. So Laura, would you move on a slide, because we're going to have to gallop. So I'm just finishing on this one before we wrap up. We talked about that 1 to 20 week, and something that Laura didn't touch upon. There is a stop and a start, because if they refuse you at any point, then the clock stops while you submit your appeal, and then it restarts again. So I don't want to be a depressing note, because appeals can sometimes take quite a while. So if they refuse to assess, you have to appeal, but the clock doesn't continue to run for 20 weeks. It stops until you get a decision on your appeals being upheld, and then it restarts at that week 6 or at that week 16. So that's something to be aware of.